Right. Hello, everybody. Thank you for sparing the time after what will have been a very, very busy day, I'm sure, for the last session within this chunk of CPD that I've done in partnership with St. Wilfrid's English Hub. I can't believe it's the fourth session. When we booked them in many what seemed like many moons ago, this seemed like it was a long time ahead, and here we are. So within session 4, what we're going to do is it's a standalone session, so there's no reason, if you haven't been to the other 3 sessions, that you can't access this as a standalone CPD session, but we are intrinsically going to build on and link to some of the CPD that we've done in the past. And in this session this evening, we're going to talk about the output side of speech and language processing. So for those of you who have been involved in the earlier CPD, in the first session, we talked about that first and most fundamental part of the speech, language and communication skill flow, about how children really needed to have those early communication skills in place so that they could develop two-way communication, so that they could tune into people, so that they understood the cause and effect of communication even before they had words. And then we built on that, and then we talked about that fundamental importance of learning to listen and to understand the spoken word, auditory skills and receptive language skills. And then in the last, more recent session, we talked about that central set of language skills, those fundamental skills, which we know of as vocabulary, and thought about how children learnt words and how children store words and connect words together. So that really was all about communication. And then it's all been about the input side of language and the storage of language in terms of vocabulary. And of course, those vocabulary skills we'll touch on again today, because although my vocabulary skills will underpin my understanding of the spoken word, my vocabulary skills, my ability to find words, to use words, to link words together into sentences, will also fundamentally influence my expressive language skills. And that's what we're going to talk about today. And then on top of expressive language, we're also going to talk about speech sound skills and the management of children who have got speech sound changes and immaturities. So really just to kind of clear up kind of what we mean by those two. Expressive language is to do with the words that I use, the way I link them together, the length of those sentences, the grammatical structure of those sentences, how I learn to use my sentences to talk in different ways, and we'll come to all of this in this session. So language is all about, the expressive language is all about the content of my output, whereas speech sounds are to do with how I say what I say. What sounds do I use? Are those sound representations of words the same as you would hear in adult speech? If I do miss sounds off, if I do swap sounds for one another, is that what you would expect to hear in speech sound development for a child my age? Or is it that actually I'm presenting with speech sound omissions and changes that you would expect to hear in younger children, or that my sound changes are more extensive? So we'll come to that. So in the world of speech and language therapy, which is my original stomping ground before I went into education, we're really quite clear about the difference between expressive language and speech. And I just kind of want to clear that up, because a lot of the time when I work with people in education, not necessarily in early years, sometimes further up schools, will use the word in education speech when really we're not meaning their speech, we're meaning their expressive language. So it's just being really clear about the distinction. So within the we'll focus on those two skill strands, the strategies that can help, and just some practical ideas and things to consider. But again, we can never look at, although you can chunk speech, language and communication into these different kind of sub-skills, when you're thinking about a child, you can never look at one chunk in isolation. So again, I work with lots of people where when you begin to talk to them, the concern is often about the level of talk in their cohort, or with certain key target children. You know, children aren't saying as much as you would expect. They're not using as much language. Their sentences aren't as long as you would expect. So again, perpetuated, I think, by the fact that in things like the observation, checkpoints in development matters, we're listening for levels of talk, and we're identifying when levels of talk aren't what they need to be. What we always need to do when we are thinking about, is talk the thing that is the main problem, is we need to go back to those earlier skill strands and think about, how does that lower level of talk, how does that concern about talk fit in with other stuff? And again, it's that idea of, is actually the biggest barrier for this child communication? The reason that they're not talking as much as they should be, and the reason I'm not hearing as much talk, is it's actually a deeper issue with communication. And in the same way, is it an issue more with the auditory and the receptive language processing? And we'll come to that. So before we begin to kind of pick at the detail of expressive language, I think a really useful thing to consider when you're looking at all of your children, particularly if you're working in the early years, but certainly if you're looking at the children who are not meeting age-related expectations with speech, language and communication development, is just to ask yourself the very broad question, does that child initiate interactions? And for some children, they initiate interactions, but they initiate those interactions non-verbally. They might come and tap us on the shoulder repetitively. They might come and shove a painting under our nose in order to get our attention. They make noises, and they might point to what they need, but they are initiating. And other children initiate interactions using talk. They just say something to start the conversation going. But this is a really useful question, because it's something that we don't always consider. We're very, very aware when children don't respond to us. But because we're so busy, we sometimes might not notice when children don't initiate interactions with us. And do you know what? When they don't do that, before you know it, we're in there, we're saying something, we're adding language, or we're asking that child a question, because ultimately we're busy, and ultimately we want to interact with this child, and we want to hear that child talk. But what we sometimes forget to realize is, because I haven't noticed that they don't initiate, and because I jump in and fill the gap and always initiate first, then I don't end up giving that child space and time to begin to do that. So I kind of, without meaning to, push them into what I would call quite a passive interaction style. So before we start talking about the nitty-gritty of adding language and verbs and grammar and things like that, it is useful to kind of have that very stand back kind of consideration, and to say, if I notice children who don't do that, I need to nip that in the bud, for want of a better phrase. And I need to see that as really important, because what I don't want is this child going through into reception, into Key Stage 1, not being able to ask questions, not being able to seek clarification if they haven't been able to understood, not being able to kind of get a conversation going. And this goes back to some of the interaction strategies that we discussed in that first session for children with more significant needs. But we go back to those principles where I would go and be alongside or in the same area as that child, but I would really resist that instinct to ask a question. I would really resist that instinct to say something quickly first to get that conversation going. And I might play alongside, I might model what the child's doing, or I might just do my own thing, making sure that I don't make a comment on what I'm doing, and then before you know it, ask them a question about what I've just said, and to just give them time and space. Now, you can't sit there for an hour waiting for them to initiate and them not initiating. We've got to kind of be reasonable. So the rule of thumb would be that we give them that space and we give them that time. And if no obvious non-verbal initiation or no obvious initiation using talk comes your way, what you would do is you would wait for the child to do something. And then at that point, you would add language about what they have done. So although they haven't deliberately initiated an interaction or initiated an interaction with talk, because you've taken what they've done as the first turn in the interaction, and then you've added language, it's not quite the same, but it's encouraging them to begin to initiate rather than us taking the lead too much. And when we do model language in interactions, either with children who don't initiate or simply children who talk less, maybe they do sometimes initiate, but they say less. They're not our chatty, active communicators. It's really important to remember to focus on modeling language and adding language rather than being a questioner. So when I ask a question, of course, I'm using a sentence of a certain grammatical structure that requires a certain type of answer. So a what question requires the child to name something. A where question requires them to name a location. A who question requires them to name a person. So there is a very kind of specific structure between questions and answers that, of course, children need to learn. But from a communication point of view, when I ask a question, what I am doing is I am saying, I am taking a turn in this interaction, and now there is an expectation that you take a turn, and there is an expectation that you take a verbal turn. And questions are seen in the world of education as ways of generating talk, encouraging talk, finding out what children know. And of course, they can be those things. But in reality, when I'm working with a child who doesn't initiate interactions or who is a very quiet and passive communicator, I will be much more productive if I ask less questions, or I would even go so far as to say, ask no questions, but just to comment, just to add language about what I am doing, about what the child is doing. And when I take a turn in an interaction that is a comment rather than a question, what I am really doing is I'm saying, I'm going to add some language, I'm going to make a comment. And then really, as a child, you could have a turn if you want to, but do you know what? There's no pressure. There's no expectation that you take a turn in the same way as there is when I ask a question. And the quatch, that's not a real word. The catch-22 of all of this is that if I do that, I will get more talk from all of my children, but I will particularly get more talk from the children who are quieter and passive, because I am taking the pressure off talk. And that kind of goes against the grain sometimes when we think about what it is to be a good teacher. But this is just the reality of interaction and principles when you're working with children who have got speech, language and communication skill gaps. And at some point then, when our usual interaction style isn't working, we have to put the brakes on and we have to stop the bus and we have to kind of say, right, I need to take a slightly different tack. I can't make the child change their interaction style or their language, but what I do have power over is what I do, how I am, what I say, how I engage in this interaction. And if I make some changes, and again, not questioning might seem the opposite of what you would want to do, but actually in reality, by making those changes, I can create that space, take the pressure off, and I will get more language back from certain children in particular. So when we're adding language, whether we're making these comments for children who are quieter, who don't initiate, or when we're just kind of adding language generally, I think it's important that we are really aware of the child's age, of course, and what we would be expecting the child to be able to understand and to process at that age. But we particularly need to be aware of that when we're thinking that their receptive language, their ability to listen to and process spoken language, might not be at the level that would be expected for their age. And we have to be aware, like we said in early sessions, that sometimes effective language enrichment and high quality interactions will actually need to involve me saying less. It will actually need to involve me chunking what I say into shorter utterances, leaving gaps between those utterances to give children time to process what has been said. And rather than saying lots and lots of different things, to go back over and to repeat the same phrases or to repeat the same words a few times within the same interaction. And that is important because there are a lot of very broad terms bandied out at the minute. Things like language enrichment, things like we want to see quality interactions. And you know what? That's fabulous, because it's like, it is so valuable how we interact with and how we speak to children in the early years. But the problem with these very broad terms is that a quality interaction with a 3.5 or a 4-year-old child with really strong language skills is really different from a quality interaction with a 3.5-year-old or a 4-year-old who is struggling to listen, struggling to process language, not saying very much. Does that kind of make sense? So whenever somebody said, oh, okay, everybody's talking about quality interactions, what should a quality interaction look like, Kirstie? I'm like, I can't answer that question simply, because if you're going to ask me that question, I'm going to throw a question back to you first. And the question I'm going to throw back is, who are you talking to? Who's the child you're interacting with? What are their skills like? Are they meeting age-related expectations? If there are gaps, what kind of gaps are they? And then those gaps and where they are and what they can do needs to be taken into consideration as you interact with them. And if you take those things into consideration and simplify your language if need be, make sure that you're still face-to-face if need be, do lots of repetition if still need be, then that will be a quality interaction for that child. Does that kind of make sense? So all of this is kind of linking together with those other sessions, but we need to be aware of our language load in relation to auditory, processing and receptive language, but we also need to be aware of our language load for moving children's expressive language skills on, because a lot of children who have got expressive language delay, they have an expressive language delay as a knock-on effect of their receptive language delay. But there are some children whose understanding of language is fine, and the delay just begins with the expressive side. So when you've got receptive language processing, the simplification does two things. It helps the child process and understand what's being said, and it also gives the child achievable models to have a go at copying. But even when a child's receptive language skills is okay and it's just their expressive language, there still is that need to simplify our language models, because what we're wanting to do is model achievable next steps for that child. So even if they could understand us if we spoke in much longer sentences, where are the models of how to kind of copy back short word combinations, short phrases, or certain grammatical structures? We need to be aware that that simplification then becomes more of a strategy just for expressive language, but still a really important strategy. So we've already said this: consider comprehension, consider vocabulary skills. If we're wanting to improve talk, do we actually need to kind of concentrate on improving talk, or do we actually need to concentrate our efforts on improving understanding and improving vocabulary, or comprehension or vocabulary? And as a result of those efforts, the talk will follow, the talk will improve accordingly. So again, with this concept of skill flow, you might want talk to improve, but if the real biggest barrier is with the input and with the vocabulary, if you put your efforts into that, the level of talk will improve. So whenever your concern begins with levels of talk, we need to go through this whole process of course you want talk to improve, but is talk specifically what you really need to focus on, or is it one of these underpinning foundation skills? So let's kind of move though to thinking more specifically about expressive language. And I will probably have mentioned quite a few times through the course of this training the fundamental importance of verb vocabulary. And again, if you're going to take away just one thing from this training, take away the fact that verbs are really important. If you look, and so if I think way back to the days when I used to get referred, children who were like 25, 26 months, maybe a little bit older, as late talkers. They had a few single words, but not many. Or some of them had quite a lot of single words, but they weren't linking words together. If you began to discuss with parents, and if you began to kind of look at the words that the child knew and didn't know, what you would often find for those children who weren't moving into linking words together was that they possibly knew a few nouns, naming words, or they might even know quite a lot of nouns, quite a lot of naming words, but their vocabulary wasn't broad. They didn't really have any or many verbs at all. So without verbs, it becomes very difficult to join words together. It becomes very difficult to move into sentence formation. So as a specific target for some children who might be stuck at much, much earlier levels of expressive language development, or if you're working with younger children, something that you need to consider for all of those young children is to really emphasize and value verb vocabulary, because that will be giving them a vocabulary building block which will allow them to move into sentence formation. And even when children are beginning to link words together, building that bank of verb vocabulary will allow children to move from basic sentences to more complex sentences, and to be able to talk in a wider variety of ways for a wider variety of purposes. And actually, when you're young, the main reason you want to talk is to tell people about what you're doing. And also, once you can talk out of the here and now, to tell people about what you're going to do, about what you did before. That's the main reason you want to talk. You know, you're not really always motivated by talking about what things are like, or by talking about what sounds are in words. You're really motivated by, what am I doing? What am I going to do? What did I do before? And by building and nurturing that verb vocabulary with our children, we give them the building blocks to say the things that they actually want to say. And this isn't something that you're not doing already. This is part of your practice already. This is part of your interactions already. But a really good thought process for you and your team, this has to involve the whole team, is to see what you do, everything you do, as an opportunity to enrich verb vocabulary. So if you took your Play-Doh area, for example, what are the verb opportunities that Play-Doh and the resources that go along with the Play-Doh, what are the verb opportunities that creates? Let's have a look at our home corner. What are all the verbs we could possibly use within our home corner? If you're doing a specific activity like planting seeds or whatever, you know, what are the verb opportunities that activity creates? So that when you're within that activity and you're busy interacting with the children, talking about what you're doing, talking about activity, adding that verb vocabulary becomes much more naturally, because the priority, the value of verbs has been raised amongst your team. Then kind of another useful thing to do is like, well, what would be the earliest, most basic verbs we would expect in this area? What would be those kind of like middle layer of verbs, and what would be the less familiar, more advanced verbs? So that with certain children, when I am talking about what we're doing, I might focus on going back to and modeling the basics and saying those basic early verbs quite a few times, rather than trying to kind of say everything. And with some children, they'll already have the basics. So I think, right, okay, I need to be inclusive, but I also need to be progressive. How do I kind of say, right, okay, I'll accept those basic verbs that you've got, and I'll begin to add some more specific verbs, some different verbs, and who's really got quite strong talk. And so actually now my role in my interaction is to kind of move that on even further. And one of the things that you will notice for some children, once they do have some verbs and once they do move into sentences, is you'll have some children who will really use a few verbs an awful lot. Do, put, got. And those verbs are really, really handy, because they can be used in multiple situations. So I could be in the mark making area and I could be drawing a picture, and I could say to you, I do my mum, and I get my message across. Really important that when you repeat that back, or when you're modeling what you're saying, oh, you're drawing your mum. Oh, I'm going to draw a flower. So that those verbs get the message across. They enable the child to move into sentences, And there's nothing wrong with them, because as adults, we use those verbs too. But what I need to make sure in my interactions is that I enable the child to sometimes say do, put, or got, but to say more specific verbs as well, because I've focused on that in my interactions. So verbs are important, really, really important. But another thing that I'm kind of wanting to kind of listen out for, but one thing that I'm also wanting to nurture as I move my children's skills on, is obviously this progression of utterance length over time. So when I'm thinking about children's expressive language, it can be useful to think about when it comes to early sentences, I'm wanting to listen out for three main things. One is their expressive language, and not their expressive, sorry, one is their vocabulary, should I say. One is their utterance length, and the other is their grammatical structure, which we're going to come to in a few minutes. And what I will find is I've got children who are at earlier levels of success with all three of those things. But I will have children who have got stronger skills with some things and earlier levels of success with other things, if that kind of makes sense. So I'm thinking about in my last full-time class, there was a boy called Jack. He used really age-appropriate length of sentences. His grammatical structure was age-appropriate, but he used lots of non-specific verbs. He used lots of it, that, there, lots of non-specific vocabulary. So when I first listened to Jack, to be honest, he wasn't on my radar for having any language gaps, because his sentences were long and his grammatical structure, and on top of that, his speech was clear. But when I began to think in a little bit more detail about these different aspects of expressive language, I could see that actually from a vocabulary point of view, he had gaps that needed to be filled. So don't get me wrong, I didn't run down the corridor and kind of try and find my Senko because I was so concerned. It wasn't, obviously it's kind of not a gap like that, but it's still a gap that I need to be aware of and I need to think about. Whereas for other children, what I notice is they're still only using single words, or they're still only using 2 or 3 word combinations, when other children around them are beginning to use much longer sentences. Really important to consider what their understanding is like, but it's also really important to consider, well, when did they start to talk? Was it that actually just a few weeks ago they were only using single words, and my goodness me, listen to them now, they're now joining words together. Okay, there's still a gap there, but I am seeing progress, and I am seeing that child moving towards what would be expected, but I can't, that child can't miss steps out. They've got to go through that process. But where there are issues with utterance length, we've got to be aware of that language load from ourselves as well. So if we're thinking about how long the child's sentences are, well, what would be their next step? If they were using single words, I of course want to build that single word vocabulary, but my next step would be for that child to begin to link 2 words together. If they were linking 2 words together, my next step would be that they will begin to link 3 words together and begin to use some very early elements of grammatical structure, so that when I am talking with them, I am not going to take away all of the grammatical structure in my talk, but I'm going to bring my talk back down so that my sentences might have some grammatical structure in them. Of course they will. But I'm going to model sentences that have got 2 or 3 main words in them, so that I'm modeling the child's next steps, if that kind of makes sense. So that strategy is a really simple interaction strategy. We need to make sure that we see ourselves as one of the biggest intervention tools that we have, and that the more we think about and consider how we are and what we say, the more effective we can be. But that ability to model a child's next steps is ever present. So even if the child hasn't said something to me first, when I add language, I can still add it in a way that models the child's next steps. But that strategy kind of comes into its own again when a child says something to me first. And if my target, if my next step is to encourage the child to begin to have new vocabulary, but also to begin to link more words together, one of the most simple but one of the most effective interaction strategies is to have repeat back and add one. Maybe different speech and language therapists might call it something slightly different, but really I mean where you take what the child has said, you accept what they've said, but you repeat it back, but you add another key piece of information on. So within the give and take of that interaction, you're either reinforcing a word that that child already knows, or it might be that you're adding a new piece of vocabulary. But in addition to that, you're saying, hey, guess what? Listen to this. In not too long, you could be using sentences that sound a bit like this because this is your next step. So that in reality, a lot of our intervention is driven by that give and take of conversation and by that give and take of interactions. And that will be the most productive way we give the children what they need. And that can be within child initiated. It could be within a focus activity. But do you know what? It could also be when I'm helping that child put their coat on, or it could be at snack time or what have you. So that these interaction strategies are not resource or they're not activity specific. They're ever present, but really, really, really valuable. And again, these are useful things to talk to parents and carers about if you feel that they need some support with how to manage and to model language. So we've already talked about being really careful about the verbs that we use, but vocabulary is obviously much deeper than verbs. So as well as having non-specific verbs, we can have children use those non-specific pronouns, this one, that one, there, it, which again are really handy because they allow the child to get their message across. And as adults, we use those words a lot as well. But that it's about kind of saying sometimes children over rely on that non-specific vocabulary because they don't have the more specific words. And when they're linking words together, it's easier to link them together with kind of generic non-specific words. And that's about making sure that we're modeling those more specific ones. But also we're doing that where we would repeat back what the child has said, but we would add the right word in. So, or not the right word, but the more specific verb or noun in. And that's really important. But also as well, this notion of repeating back and refining children's vocabulary. Although it's the most obvious when, if the child said, I go over there, then you said, oh, you went to the sand pit or what have you, so that you're repeating it back, but you're adding kind of the more specific detail. This repeat back and refine can also be really important for building vocabulary, even when existing vocabulary is there. So it might be to give children more specific nouns. So it might be that you're outside and the child comments or says something about there being a flower, for example. But so great, they know what a flower is. But again, you use that interaction to maybe add in the specific name for that flower, or to give them some specific vocabulary about petals or leaves or something like that. It might be that the child is role playing and they're playing on the telephone and saying, I tell my mum this, I tell my mum that, whatever. This is just an example off the top of my head. And you could repeat back and say, oh, you told your mum. So you could repeat it back and model that past tense grammar, which is important. But again, you could at other times, and it depends kind of what your priority is, and in given, you might say, oh, did you explain to your mummy? Or, did you describe what we did? Did you describe what we did to your mummy? Does that kind of make sense? So sometimes, even when there is a word being used and the word is good and the word is right, you can still use that give and take of that interaction to say, oh, here's a more specific word, or here's a word that will allow you to name the parts of that flower, or here is a kind of a different verb to move you away from that verb just to tap. Does that kind of make sense? And I think that's really important. The delivery of it is so simple, but it's something that's so important that you talk about as a team, that you reflect on, and that it just becomes a really significant part of your practice. So of course, we've got utterance length, we've got the vocabulary used, and then of course we've got grammatical structure, all three of which are important. And you will have some children with gaps with all three, as I've already said. Or I'm thinking about George, again, a real boy, and he had utterance length that was fine. His vocabulary was age appropriate, but he had certain grammatical structures that were still similar to that which would have been expected. So he was still, there's me this, me that, him this, him that instead of he, them instead of they. And again, it was just that was the way it had been, and we'd done lots of modeling, and it started to kind of stand out because all of Georgie's other expressive language skills were much more advanced, but this pronoun immaturity, these grammatical immaturities, were almost like still left behind. Whereas there was another boy in the same class who again had those same grammatical immaturities, but he was still speaking in much shorter sentences. His understanding of language wasn't massive, it wasn't significantly below, but it wasn't age appropriate. There was a gap there. So when you think about the grammatical kind of immaturities that Joshua had, Joshua's grammatical immaturities were more in line with his overall level of language, because he was just language-wise like a younger child, but across the board. So I'm not saying that we didn't need to model those grammatical structures for Joshua. Of course we did. But with George, they began to stand out, and we began to target them a bit more specifically, because actually everything else about George's talking was moving on. Does that kind of make sense? So with Joshua, we just stuck with that, repeating it back, but in the right way, not drawing any attention to it. Whereas as he approached reception with George, we did start to say to him, not every time, but sometimes, oh, George, can you say it like this? I have a computer. So me have a computer. So we would say, oh, you've got a computer. Can you have a go like this? Can you say, I have a computer? Now, you wouldn't do that with most young children, But we began to do that with George as he got a bit older, because the modelling hadn't worked. He was still kind of stuck in that grammatical rut, but also because he had the understanding and because he had the other expressive language skills to be able to cope with that. But if in doubt, we just want to be accepting what the child has said and repeating it back in the right way. So there we're given examples of pronoun immaturities, which are very common, but children can have grammatical immaturities with other types of grammatical structure within early sentences. So the ability to mark negatives within sentences, pronouns we've already discussed, the ability to mark and use pronouns, not pronouns, sorry, plurals, if I can read properly, the ability to formulate and use different questions, and also that ability to take two short utterances but link them together using words like and, but, so, because. And you can hear children kind of using short utterances, and then they go through that process where they will use those short utterances, but they'll use them side by side. They've got kind of a connected idea, but they're using two isolated sentences. And when you kind of hear that, that is a ripe time for you to take those two short utterances they've used, to accept them, but to repeat them back with a connecting word together. And if a child is at that stage, what you might want to do is not always wait for those opportunities that are driven by the child, but within your interactions, to deliberately model two little sentences together, but joined by a linking word. So deliberately, if we're in the water area together, I might say, I'm filling the jug and I'm going to tip it out. It's not rocket science, but what I'm doing is I'm aware that that child could say those things as two short, but they're not linking them together. So all I'm doing is providing a model for a grammatical next step. So when we kind of aware of those grammatical structures, and I suppose I've already kind of given an example of this, we can kind of take what the child has said and we can model it back in the right way, but we can also do that targeted modeling of the structures that we are thinking are the child's next steps. And of course, the opportunities to model these different grammatical structures are ever present in our learning environment. But, you know, it's just little things like when we were modeling pronouns with George and with Joshua, it's just about making those connections where we've got opportunities all the time because we've got other children around us all the time. We've got opportunities within the books and the stories that we share. But also we've got small world, little play figures, toy figures. You know, in the gluing and sticking area, I'm deliberately going to put some old toy and clothes catalogues in there so that as we're cutting them out and sticking them, it just creates additional opportunities for me to add that kind of targeted pronoun language. So you don't often have to deliberately create grammatical opportunities because they're there all the time. But again, it is interesting to scan your environment and to think, well, where do those opportunities come up really well? Or if a child needed lots of prompting with use of negative grammar, for example, you know, just little things like when we're tidying things away or getting things out, I can deliberately say, oh, This one does not go in there. This is an animal. That is not an animal. That needs to go in here because these are animals. So sometimes those opportunities are there. We've just got to make that connection. But also if I'm doing some sorting activities where I might be sorting things by shape, I might be sorting things by colour, I might be sorting things depending on whether they go in the same topic or not. Those sorting opportunities also give me great opportunities to model when something is and when something is not, or at a higher level when something is or when something isn't. Does that kind of make sense? So again, I might be doing those sorting activities for completely different reasons, but I make connections and I see the grammatical opportunities that activity provides, or that interaction provides. So when we're thinking about basic talk, and here I'm moving away from structure, I suppose I'm moving more into why am I talking? What is the purpose of my talk? Then really when we look at very young children, we tend to see them using talk in three main ways. One, I use talk to name, to tell you about what things are. I use talk to describe activity, to talk about what I'm doing, to talk about what you're doing, to talk about what somebody else is doing, to talk about what's happening in a picture that we're looking at. And then I use talk to describe quality, which is where I use talk to talk about what something is like, what something looks like, what something feels like, what something sounds like, what something smells like or tastes like. And eventually, when I have children using descriptive skills and beginning to tell stories or to offer me recounts, I want them to be able to describe quality and activity at the same time. But if we're thinking about the younger children, we have to think about the building blocks that will build into that. So when you are using your interactions to model language, make sure that you are balancing modeling all of those three things and deliberately kind of prioritizing that use of verbs to describe activity, because that's probably the poor relation sometimes of our interactions. And as educators, we're often ingrained to talk about what things are like and to describe the quality of things. So in some respects, we're doing that really well already. We don't need any encouragement to do that. That's something that we're almost like born to do. But we do need to balance that out with making sure that we prioritize that description of activity, where it's what is happening, and the verb, the vocabulary, that becomes kind of a little bit of a higher priority. So that's kind of about very basic reasons why I talk, and actually, as well as listening to the structure of talk, as children begin to talk a little bit more, I need to have that radar on things like we said right back at the beginning. Well, who's initiating with talk and who's actually waiting for me to always start the conversation first. But I also need to be having my eye on the ball of children kind of talking for different purposes, talking to different people. Who do they talk to? Do they just come and talk to me all the time? Or do they talk to other adults and their peers all the time? I'm looking for not just the structure of your talk, but socially, how do you talk and why do you talk? And a really important skill that is crucial in language development, but crucial for a child to move on and engage in a lot of our teaching and learning experiences, is the ability to talk out of the here and now. And if language is going well, normally children make this shift after the age of 3. And what it means is when I am young, I generally talk about things that I'm doing and things that I can see. And that is the way that language is learnt, but it's also the easiest way for me to offer language, because as well as finding the words and putting them together, I've got visual support. I can see what it is that we're talking about. And when my language moves on to the next level, I will begin to be able to tell you about things at home, even when I'm at nursery or school. And even if I can't see anybody or anything to do with home, I'll be able to talk about school when I go home. I'll be able to talk about what we did this morning, even though I can't see anything to do with that activity anymore. And I'll also be able to talk about things that I'm going to do. Or if we went on a trip to the farm last week, I'll be able to tell you things that we did and things that I can remember. So sometimes when I can remember what we did on the farm, it's not just as simple as remembering. It's about having the language skills to, without visual support, go back into my language mechanism, find the words that I need to be able to turn them into a sentence, and to do that when I'm not at the farm and when I can't see anything associated with the farm. So sometimes people say to me, oh, do you know what? I've got children who talk. I've got children who are quite happy to talk, and they're quite happy to offer language in child initiated. But when it comes to adult-led group time, they don't offer any language at all, or they hardly say anything. Now, there are lots of reasons why that could be. It could be an issue with following an adult-led agenda. It could be that the child doesn't like talking on demand when they're not motivated to talk for that purpose. It could be that the child doesn't like to offer language in front of lots of other children. But one of the reasons that we rarely consider is that often when we're sitting in a circle and talking, particularly if a lot of my other children now can do this, is we're often talking about things that we can't necessarily see. And I often say to people, right, okay, play around with that. How do they participate in that group if you bring visual support in? If you have pictures, or if you have props and objects that are related to that subject that you are talking about. If you had been on a trip to the farm, but you suddenly put out some some photograph material, or you bring in some resources from your farm play area, but that they're things that were actually at the farm you went to see, would the child suddenly be able to remember and offer you some talk because of the visual support? So you need to kind of be thinking about visual support for all young children, but where you will continue to need that visual support for longer to help children understand what you have said, but also for some children to help them formulate those sentences and to be able to contribute verbally, because without that visual support, they might not be able to. However, everything in life is always about a balance. And as children's skills build, you will be wanting to create opportunities to encourage them to talk out of the here and now without always having visual support. So it's about kind of providing that kind of context when they're young, providing that support when they still need it. But at some point then, you also need to play about with taking that support away. Does the child still need the support? In which case we'll bring it back out. Or actually, are we ready to kind of maybe move on a little bit? Because it's all about inclusion, but it's all about progression. And if you keep using support that actually the child doesn't necessarily need anymore, they're ready to move on to the next step, then what we can do is we can stifle and hinder that progression. So it's always better to support than not to support, but never always support, and for support for too long without that ongoing monitoring of progress and that ongoing just kind of playing about with, well, what would happen if I took that? Does that kind of make sense? You don't need to permanently take the support away, but you need to see whether the child is ready to move on to the next level. And when a child is potentially ready to move on to that next level of talking out of the here and now without visual support, it can be useful to provide opportunities where we talk about what we did immediately after what we did, or we talk about what we're going to do immediately before what we're going to do. Does that kind of make sense? So that if there is an issue, we can quite quickly go back to the activity or start the activity, and then the language and the visual support is there. But I create that opportunity in a very incremental, realistic, achievable step to see if a child can begin to talk out of the here and now without visual support. And as we move into kind of higher level expressive language, we're of course looking for children being able to talk in different ways. And here we begin to use terms that we're very familiar with when we're thinking about writing, and that's to use language to retell, where I retell a story that I've listened to and internalized, to tell my own stories, and that's different. When I tell my own stories, I probably go back to my bank of story experiences where I will understand story language and story structure. But when I tell my own stories, the ideas, the words, the imagination comes from me. So actually, within our story experiences, we need that balance. We need that balance of retelling, because that's where children internalize that story language. They internalize those mantras. They have that chance to be repetitive. But we need to make sure that we don't only ever retell other people's stories, that as language skills begin to move on, that we create opportunities where children can tell their own stories, or we give them a story structure, but within that story structure we leave gaps, and they think of the characters, or they generate the ideas of what that character found or what that character did next, so that we're giving them the scaffold of the story structure, but I'm asking them to contribute creatively ideas, because in reality, I want the children to have both experiences and both sets of skills. When I retell, fabulous, but really when I retell, I'm regurgitating somebody else's imagination. I'm not using my own imagination. And obviously recounts are, again, building on that ability for the child to tell me about things that have happened and things that they have done, but where they might begin to tell me about a sequence of activities or a sequence of things that they have done. But it all stems back to that earlier ability to talk out of the here and now and to use sentences, and then we begin to move on and be able to link and sentences together. So that's kind of all to do with like the mechanics of of expressive language, but we also do need to have our eye on that social communication radar. We've already talked about the fundamental importance of initiation. We've also talked about having that eye on the ball of Who does the child talk to? Do they talk to different people? Do they talk to adults and peers? So that we've got that kind of range of social interactions. And if the child only talks to adults and not to peers, then within child initiated, I need to be working alongside that child, modeling and coaching that child as to how they can begin to talk with their peers, maybe doing some work on turn taking within child initiated learning to hook that child into the interactions of other children. And when we're thinking about social communication, it really has to be done in the moment. It really has to be done alongside interactions, alongside daily routines, alongside child initiated. It's very difficult to build these skills on the carpet in adult-led groups, but my goodness me, they're really important skills. So as well as initiating, another skill that I need to be working or looking out for and working on if need be is that next step of initiation, which is not just initiating language with talk, but it's initiating language, but using language to ask. And I will have some children who need that targeting alongside me building up their basic expressive language. But I will have other children who can talk in sentences perfectly fine. But do they use language to ask? No, they don't. They tell me what they need. They tell me what they want. When they have forgotten to roll their sleeves up, when they've been in the water, they hold their arms out and say, my jumper's really wet. Absolutely it is. But really what the child means is, please, can you help me take my jumper off? But they're making their needs known, but they're not using language to ask. And I need to be aware of that. This is a really important social communication skill, but it's an important skill to have to be able to function within a classroom learning environment. And really, I don't want my children, if I can help it, going into Key Stage 1, not being able to use language to ask. And why do I need my children to be able to ask? I need them to be able to use language to ask because they will need to ask for help. First of all, help with their wet jumper, but also later on, help when they don't know what to do, or help when they're stuck with something. And, you know, people further up schools will say, you know, not asking for help is a real big issue. And you kind of think, well, one of the first things I want to be asking about those children who don't ask for help is, do they know how to use language to ask? You know, is it just that they don't ask, that they could ask, but they choose not to ask for help? Or is it that they don't know how to do that? They don't know how to use language in that way. But of course, I want my children to use language to ask so that they can join in with other children, that they can ask for a turn, either to join in or when another child is hogging all of the turns. And of course, similar to asking for help, but more specific, I want my children to be able to ask so that they can ask me when they don't understand, or maybe they can ask when they don't know what a word means. And if I can have children doing that, then they can identify and they can flag up their own gaps in vocabulary, their own gaps in learning, and then I can do something about it. But if they don't flag them up, it takes for me to work it out, or for me to kind of notice later that the child isn't really. Does that kind of make sense? So it is really important. So when you are working on asking, you need to do it in the moment. And I think what is really important is we need to model and coach the child how to ask. So the first thing that you need to do is think, like, okay, what would be achievable for this child, bearing in mind what you know about their sentence skills. So let's just take the wet jumper example. So I've got a child who can completely speak in sentences and who says to me, my jumper's really wet. Now, what I don't want to do is say, oh, do you need help with your jumper? Oh, yes, I do. You've interacted with the child, but you haven't modelled or helped them learn how to ask. So you would say something like, and this is just off the top of my head, for a child who could speak in sentences, you say, oh gosh, yes, it is, isn't it? So what you need to say is, please, can you help me with my jumper? That is achievable for that child. But what I am doing is I am modelling exactly what the child has said and encouraging them to take that turn again in the interaction. For a different child who is able to say much less, I might just say, okay, so what you need to say is, help, please, and encourage them to take that turn. And for other children, it will be a sentence somewhere in the middle. For a child who is not ready to repeat back that help, please, I might say, do you know what? Asking is going to be a target of mine with this child, but not yet. At the minute, I just want this child to talk. So for some children, I might not even go there. I might just say, oh, your jumper is wet. Look at your jumper. Your jumper is very wet. Because here, the fact that they can't ask will come later, or hopefully they will learn to ask. But here my priority is using words, linking words together to use just some little two-word combinations. Does that make sense? So although supporting asking is something that you will want to do for the vast majority of children within your cohort, and you'll just need to be careful about what your expectations are and what you model. For some children at earlier stages of language development, it is just talking and words that you would want to focus on, and using language to ask would be something on your radar just a little bit later on. So the very last leg of this session, and it's not because it's less important, it's because the strategies to support us are much fewer and much more simple, really. Will be those children who have got speech sound changes. So if you've got children with speech sound changes, it is usually the easiest speech, language and communication thing to notice. And normally it's the one thing that parents are going to be more concerned about over and above other things. Not always, but a lot of the time parents will be more concerned about speech sound changes than they will be about issues with understanding, for example. I qualified as a therapist in 1996, and in all of those years, I have only ever had one mum come up to me and say, when I talk to her, I don't think my daughter fully understands what I say. I've only ever had one parent come to me and identify that that's a problem. I've had lots of parents where you work them round to understanding that their child has got a receptive language gap. But I've had loads of parents who will say, oh, they can't say this sound, they can't say that sound, because it's the most obvious one. Whenever we're working with children, though, who have got speech sound changes, we have to go back. Is it just speech sounds, or are there communication and language gaps as well? That's really important. And although speech sounds are really, really important, it will be gaps with language, gaps with understanding that will cause the most significant knock-on effect with learning and in the world of education. But of course, whether there are language gaps or whether speech sounds is the child's only issue, we need to think what we're going to do about it. And with speech sounds, particularly within the early years, it's mainly about your management strategies within interaction. And I need to realise that for the vast majority of children in the early years, can you fasten my tote instead of can you fasten my coat? That child will think that they are saying can, that child will think that they're saying fasten, and that child will think that they're saying coat in the same way as I am. So if I said to them, your tote, most children would turn around and say, no, my tote, because they can hear it, most children, in our talking, but when they say it, it comes out the way that their words are stored, and at the minute they're stored with immature sound representations in them. So I've got to kind of say, do you know what, if I correct them, they're not going to know what I'm talking about because they think that they've said it right. And if I correct them, I'm going to make them aware that there's an issue when they're not aware that there's an issue yet. And actually, I want to avoid that awareness for as long as possible because I want that child to keep being a confident talker, to keep coming up to me, to tell me things, to show me things. So the management strategy, which kind of builds on all of those things, is that we take what a child has said, we accept it, and we make no attempt to correct it, but we do model it back in the right way. Excuse me, that's fundamentally important. And that's what we need to do most of the time. We need to make sure that parents and carers at home are doing that as well, that they're not reinforcing immature speech sound changes, which can sometimes sound very cute, but actually we need to be repeating it back in the right way. That's really important. But of course, repeating it back in the right way can be difficult when you haven't understood what they have said. And so when you haven't understood what you have said, where possible, the rule of thumb would be that you would take the blame. So it is a little white lie, but it's a white lie for the greater good, that, oh, it's too noisy here. I'm sorry, but I can't hear very well with all this noise. Can you show me? Something like that. Or, do you know what? I don't know what one of those is. Can you tell me something about it? Or tiredness, or earache, or whatever excuse of your choice. But what you're doing is you're not trying to fob the child off and going, ah, yes, when you haven't understood. You're acknowledging that there is some breakdown in communication, but you're not putting the blame on the child. You're taking the blame and trying to get round it. And that is fundamentally so different from the child's point of view to say, oh, I'm sorry, I don't know what you're saying. That we really kind of want to be avoiding that at all costs, even though it's the truth, because actually we want that long-term kind of interest in interacting together, and that lack of awareness, we need that to keep going and for that awareness to be avoided for as long as possible. And by saying to children where possible, can you show me? Then I give myself visual and contextual support. If we do, I don't know, sharing news, for example, and that becomes a really tricky time because the child wants to tell me lots, but I wasn't there at the weekend, I don't know what they've done, then I can support myself by allowing that child to bring in something. And if I don't want to make it just for that child, I can open that up to other children to be inclusive. I could encourage parents or carers to share some photos that we can have a look at as the child talks about what they've done, give myself some context, give myself some visual support, or even just a couple of notes in a little home diary. It might not enable me to understand everything, but it'll enable me to latch on ideally to some key words and some key messages within what the child has said. If you can, it can be really useful where children, well, for all children with speech sound changes, but particularly for children who are a little bit more difficult to understand, is to work out their code, to work out their pattern of sound changes. So there are some children who change sounds in very random ways, but they're not very numerous. Most children who change sounds and who miss sounds, they do it with a very kind of set pattern. So the child who says, "Tan, you fatten my tote," chances are they will say "tup of toffee" instead of "cup of coffee." They'll say "tat" instead of "cat." They'll say "dote" instead of "goat," because they're swapping certain sounds. And if they're saying "fatten" instead of "fasten," chances are they'll probably say something like "pider" for "spider," because there is that kind of tendency also to change two consonants into one consonant. So if you find a child difficult to understand, it's definitely worth listening closely and looking for their pattern. And then when they say something to you, it doesn't mean that you will definitely understand. It just means that you become a little bit aware in a more narrow sense of what those possibilities might be, of what the child might be saying. And certainly as a speech and language therapist who used to go into settings, I had a fabulous job when I used to work for Sunderland Local Authority, Sunderland NHS, where I used to go into nursery schools, foundation settings all the time. And people used to say to me, "Oh, how can you understand them so quickly? We've only just tuned into them." It's not because I had any magical skill. It was just because my training meant I automatically worked out the pattern of their speech sound changes. That was part of the assessment process. But because you do that, it makes it easier. Not always easy, but easier for you to understand that child. And by working out the pattern as well, it allows you to kind of say, let me wind the clock forward 3 months, 4 months. Has that child made progress? I'm with them every day, apart from weekends and school holidays. So it's really difficult for me to judge whether they have made progress or not. Have they actually got better? Or have I just tuned into them? Have I just got used to the way they say different things? If you've worked out their code, it means that you can go back in the future, and it means that you can kind of think about, have they improved? Have some of those sounds that they used to swap, now are they in their words or not? And the last two things, with young children, we very, very rarely work directly on speech sounds unless you are directed to otherwise by a speech and language therapist who knows that child. But what we can do is we can work on skills like their auditory discrimination, their ability to listen to environmental sounds, to listen to differences between words that sound nearly the same, to begin to move on and to listen to sounds within words, or words that start with different sounds and sort them out, or words that all start with the same. All of this is part of your kind of early phonic preparation, but those very same activities will really be supportive for children with speech sound changes, and also again correlated with your phonic preparation, those activities where we do things like clap out words by syllables, focus on words that rhyme, have that combination of rhyme and rhythm together. So within our stories, we have Hairy McClary from Donaldson's Dairy, and we have Iggity, Ziggity, Zaggity, Zoom, and we have Don't Put Your Finger in the Jelly, Nelly. All of those things that we can weave into our phonic preparation, but also into our stories times, into our song and rhyme times, that build phonological awareness skills, can also be tremendously supported not just for phonic readiness, but for children with speech sound changes, speech sound delay, because it just gets them to listen and to think more closely about the structure of words and what words sound like, but without us having to correct them and without us having to draw overt attention to their speech. There may come a time when there needs to be some more direct speech work. And again, a speech and language therapist might ask you to do that earlier with certain children. But the general rule of thumb is management and work on listening and work on phonological awareness. And on that note, I am going to stop sharing. We'll kind of end the session there. We're nearly bang on time, but hopefully we've got